Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. This is a Friday afternoon Hot Politics Lab session. And today, Friday, the 11th of February, we have a special guest with us. We have Amelie Godefroidt. Amelie is a postdoctoral researcher at the university, at the Department of Sociology and Political Science in Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And Amelie actually did her PhD in the Flammers Research Institute at the Center of Research on Peace and Development at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And for her work, she has received the prestigious award from the Political Communication Division of the International Communication Association in 2021 for the best dissertation. Amelie's research focuses on the emotional and socio-political consequences of political violence, especially on what is labeled as terrorism in public and elite discourse. Research methods that Amelie typically works with include experimental and survey data, as well as content analytical and meta-analytical techniques. And her work has been published in highly ranking journals, including the Journal of Communication, AJPS, and the Journal of Peace Research. The title of her work today, of her speech today, will be as follows: How Terrorism is Changing Us. Without further delay, Amelie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for these nice words. I'm just gonna share the screen. So if everything works, you should see the slides right now. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here because I have been following a few Hot Politics Labs, and they always have great discussions. So I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to present my latest publication, the AGPS publication on how terrorism is changing us. And so for over 2 decades, and of course, especially since the 9/11 attacks, researchers have sought to understand how and why we change after terrorist acts or threats of terrorism. And let us first have a look at the how question. So how exactly do we change in times of threat, or when we are participating in an experiment? How do we change? And so first, we see that terrorism is often associated with people's attitudes towards outgroups, and especially with harder and more negative attitudes towards Muslims, Arabs, immigrants, or refugees in particular. And such outgroup hostility often translates into the support of restrictions for the rights and liberties of these disliked groups, also support in more restrictive anti-immigration policies. So one cluster of attitudes is outgroup hostility. So terrorism is linked to outgroup hostility. However, it's not only policy attitudes or policy preferences regarding outgroups that change in the wake of an attack, but evidence also points into a more general right-wing shift in times of terrorism. And so I'm thinking about documented changes in military support, so support for military action or interventions as a solution to terrorism, or stronger preferences for national security measures that often come at the expense of our civil liberties. But we also see a boost in the popularity of right-wing, authoritarian, or populist parties and politicians in times of terrorism. So that's the second cluster that I found in the literature. And then third, as yet another way of coping with the terrifying threat of terrorism, we see that citizens actually also tend to bolster their attachment to and trust in their own nation and their leaders. And here, important thing to say, it's often majority citizens bolstering their support in their own leaders. So it's very an inward looking effect. And so we as social scientists, as you probably know, we often label as rally around the flag. So in sum, when we look at previous work, we see that in the wake of terrorist attacks, or when we feel threatened by terrorism, we tend to become more prejudiced. We turn more towards right-wing parties and ideologies, and we rally around our flag. And of course, these are important changes. And so therefore, researchers have also focused on the second important question, and that's of course a why question. We as social scientists, we're always interested in the mechanisms or the processes that underpin social phenomena. And so when I was doing the review, the meta-analysis, I also coded all the theories on which previous empirical studies were based. And very early on, it became clear that we predominantly focus on the individual level, so what's happening in people's heads. And here we see that a lot of theories speak about different cognitions and emotions that underlie these changes in times of threat. And so when we look at the cognitive level, terrorism is believed to stimulate a lot of thoughts. So it starts a lot of processes in people's minds. And for instance, firstly, it primes the idea that death might be unpredictable and unavoidable. So you can be at the wrong place at the wrong time and be a victim of terrorism. So this is, of course, one of the main tenets of, for instance, terror management theory. So this unpredictableness of death and the awareness of death changes our attitudes. But secondly, it's not only this personal feeling of insecurity and danger, but you also feel that the nation is under threat. So that terrorists attack the way you live as a Belgian or American. So it's a more national threat perception. And that's work, for instance, by Leonie Huddy and her colleagues, which is an important distinction between personal and national threat. So that's another cognition underlying threat induced changes. But then apart from threat, we also see that terrorism comes with a lot of perceptions about injustice and moral violations. And so beautiful work done by Linda Skitka, Father Ida, a good friend of mine, Carly Wayne, looks more at these injustice perceptions. So yet another process that goes on in the mind of people when they think of terrorism. And then last but not least, yet another sort of cognition that happens is, of course, blame attributions. So in the wake of an attack, we look for the culprit. And very often, especially the last decades in the West, the Muslim community as a whole, as a group, has been the main blame or the main group that has been blamed for terrorist attacks. So taken together, there are a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas, a lot of cognitions that are activated in times of threat and that are believed to stimulate these changes in political conservatism, rally effects, or outgroup attitudes. However, it's not just thinking, right? We are also human beings, we feel a lot, and terrorism also elicits a wide range of negative emotion, like a negative emotional arousal, because in the immediate aftermath of attacks, we often feel sad, we often feel angry, and of course also scared and anxious. And research here points in a few different directions with feelings of anger and moral outrage, stimulating more desire for risk-taking, measures, really retaliatory measures such as military action or populist far-right voting, while people that tend to be more scared in the wake of terrorist attacks often support more risk-aversive or precautionary measures, such as like deportation of immigrants, so let's kick them out to be safe, or more like ethnic profiling and stuff like that. However, also interesting to note here is that more research, and again, I think of Carly Wayne's and Father Ida's work, shows that anger is actually really crucial in the West. So in the West, we see that anger drives a lot of the effects. And I say in the West because I don't find that, for instance, in my Nigerian data. But so in conclusion, to sum this up, we do see that terrorism is related to both conscious and unconscious, cognitive and affective mechanisms. And of course, they're often intertwined in a very complex way. And I'm not going into that rabbit hole. That's probably for other discussions in the Hot Politics Lab. But this complex web of thoughts and emotions is thought to underlie these attitudinal responses in times of terrorism. So I think we can say that we already know quite a lot about the how we change. So these three clusters of attitudes and the why we change, why we see these changes. However, when I was reading literature and working with it, I did feel that we still had some remaining gaps in the literature. And specifically, I didn't know what the signature features were. Like I was mainly studying Nigeria and the Boko Haram insurgency. And I did feel that a lot of my knowledge, my theoretical knowledge, did not translate well in Nigeria. So I was wondering, what is my knowledge based on in the first place? What are the signature features, the countries, the dependent variables, the independent variables, the methods that we have been focusing on, right? Secondly, it also remained unclear what the average effect size is, like how strong is this change? And you can see that this was not clear because there are quite some conflicting narratives in the literature. For instance, you have a very famous and seminal book by Merola and Zackmeister, so this did Zackmeister and Jennifer Merola, and they argue that terrorism puts democracy at risk. Like that's the title of the book. So very threatening or a title that points to a big effect, right? But then in contrast, other scholars caution about such conclusions, and they say there's no effect, a null effect, or very small effects. So what is the average effect size? And related to that, of course, maybe it's just not one effect size, right? The effect sizes might not generalize across study contexts or designs. And here, generalizability, I mean conclusions across studies and not the classical sample generalization. And so to what extent do signature features color the conclusions? So do average effect sizes differ depending on these features? And so 3 gaps. So I did a 3-fold empirical design to address these gaps. First, I did just more a descriptive, in-depth review of literature. So what and how have we been studying this topic? Then taking all that evidence together, and it's quantitative evidence, I will talk about that later. What's the average effect size? So what's the average correlation coefficient between terrorism exposure, no matter how measured, and a political outcome? And then thirdly, I do meta-regressions. That's basically a moderation analysis to look where is the effect size stronger or where is it smaller. So what signature features can explain smaller or weaker or stronger effects. And so let's now go in a few technical details. I will rush through them, but I'm very happy to talk more about the statistical and methodological details in the Q&A. But so this is the summary figure of how I collected the data. And I think the summary is just that it was very painful. I did it all on my own. So for future meta-analysis, I would recommend teaming up with a good research team. Because yeah, as you see, there were quite a lot of studies that I skimmed through, that I then read full text. And then in the end, that resulted, after 5 years, in a data set with over 1,700 effect sizes. And so that's the unit of analysis. And it basically denotes a association between a sort of terrorism exposure or terrorism measure and a political outcome. So it can be an experiment where one group has been exposed to a news article about a terrorist attack, and then right-wing voting, like what party would you vote for, is measured, and that's one effect size. But of course, that experiment can also measure different outcomes. And then these are coded as different lines or different units of analysis or observation in my data. And hence they are clustered in unique studies. So that experiment is one of these 326 studies. And sometimes records, that is publications like an article or a PhD thesis or a book, they of course collect several experiments. Sometimes they do. So that's the clustering or the data structure in very brief terms. So what did I do with the data? Of course, first, every effect size had to be on the same scale. Like sometimes I had mean differences for experiments, so differences in mean between the control group and experimental groups. Sometimes there was a regression, sometimes a bivariate correlation table. So I converted all these observations or these data points into a Pearson correlation and changed the direction where necessary. So at every time that I had a positive correlation, it denotes that when terrorism threat changes or you're exposed to terrorism, your conservative attitude, your prejudiced attitudes, or your rally attitudes increase as well. So you become more prejudiced, more conservative, more patriotic, or nationalistic. And then a little small detail, I transformed the correlation coefficient because the Pearson one is quite skewed, and the Fisher set just has a nicer distribution. Then even more technical, but I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want. The meta-analysis is basically a way to average these effect sizes, weighted by the number of people in a study. So studies with more respondents, of course, will weight more because they just have more respondents. But then the 3 levels take into account that my data was quite clustered. So one respondent often answered difficult outcome measures, or there were different experimental groups. And these then again were clustered into a study. So that's a bit how the 3-level meta-analysis works. And again, I have some appendix slides to explain this more in depth. But basically, I account for sampling variation, the E term, within studies or within manuscripts, variation in between. And then with the meta-regression, I can plug in characteristics of the effect sizes as such. So was it a Muslim outgroup that was studied or a non-Muslim outgroup that was studied? And also at the higher level, I can plug in characteristics of the study. So was the study conducted in the West or the non-West, the US or not? So we can explain a little bit what we found. And so now the more interesting thing, I think, is the results, of course. And let's start with the first gap. So like I said, I really want to know what we are studying. And so this slide, I think, tells us one main thing, and that is that our field is very event-driven. So when you look at the A graph, the left one, we see spikes in data collection after 9/11, after the Madrid attacks, which co-occurred with the escalation of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And we especially see a spike after the 2015 and 2016 ISIS attacks. And then the right graph shows that publications, as we know, of course, have a little bit of delay. It takes time to publish. But so in sum, a very event-driven field. And then I think the next slide will not surprise you, and especially the right hand, the D panel. The field is also very Islamist focused. So it follows from this event-driven nature, and hence taking these two tendencies together, I might predict that, for instance, extreme right-wing attacks will go up a little bit in the future because unfortunately they occur more, but people label them as terrorism also more and more. So they're more aware of the fact that this is also terrorism. So if I do this in 5 years, the graph hopefully will change a little bit. But so event-driven and very Islamist-driven. And then secondly, of course, the second gap is the overall effect size. Like, what evidence did I find? And so here you see a table of the average correlation coefficient by outgroup type. So the important column to look here is the ZR column, so almost at the right, where you do see that for each of the 3 clusters of outgroups, we see a significant increase. Yet I think it's important to note that these are quite small. So we see a 0.13 correlation coefficient for conservative shift or prejudiced attitudes, and a 0.09 for rally effects. So besides this substantive interpretation of a small yet significant increase, these results are of course also important for us social scientists because they have an important implication for future research. And they do suggest that if you want to do future studies on this topic, you actually need quite a big sample. For like hostility and conservative shift studies, these numbers point to the need for 500 respondents if you want a power of 0.80, which is not ideal, but already good, and 1,000 respondents for rally effect studies. So they do have concrete implications also for us scientists, besides the more substantive implications of modest increases. But then thirdly, and very importantly, I think, is to what extent are these observed effect sizes explained by moderating variables? Because in my data, I saw that there was a lot of heterogeneity. So the table you saw glosses over a lot of other things that is going on. And I will just pinpoint a few important moderators, but the paper discusses more moderators. And I also built an app, an interactive website where you can play around a little bit more with heterogeneity, something which I will talk about in the very end of the presentation. But one important moderator is ideology. So we see that these studies that look at Islamist terrorist attacks or Islamist threat, prime people with Islamist jihadist terrorism, they result in effect sizes that were significantly higher than these 0.13 or 0.09 that I showed earlier. However, those studies looking at different types of attacks that might be right-wing, but also state terrorism and a few left-wing terrorist attacks, they result in non-significant, or well, the confidence interval includes a potential effect of 0 for outgroup hostility and rally effects, and a substantially lower effect for political conservatism. So a big important caveat here. So ideology determines a lot. And then when I further zoom in the rally effect, so one specific outcome, here I see that it's not only jihadist terrorism that is driving rally effects, but it's especially also US studies. So here we see that studies conducted in the United States are almost the only ones that result in a positive significant effect. We see that studies conducted in Israel, for instance, the point estimate was almost 0, like 0.004 or 5, if I remember it correctly. And then other studies in other countries, and predominantly Western European countries, they resulted in an effect of 0.05, so substantially weaker. So here other countries, no effect or very weak effect. And so I think this already points to the fact that in the paper I argue that rally effects are idiosyncratic, and I do present even more evidence for a very idiosyncratic rally effect. So this slide basically tells us 2 things. First, you see clear downward trends. So the further away we go from 9/11, the weaker the effect size becomes. And like studies conducted or published in the 2020s, they don't even have a significant effect anymore. Secondly, you also see the 2 lines where you see that studies that refer to 9/11, so they can be pre-post, but also recollect where you were at 9/11 or how did you feel when 9/11 happened. These studies also result in a significantly higher effect. So taken together in the paper, I argue that rally effects are mainly driven by a rally around President Bush in the wake of 9/11 effect. But so taking all these pieces together, and like I said in the paper, there are much more pieces of evidence. I think what the meta-analysis mainly reveals is that the study of public responses to terrorism is in practice limited to a very small and narrow question. And that is, does Islamist terrorism affect attitudes within Western societies? Because that is what we have been studying. And so on this question, I think the very cautious answer is yes. We do see some significant yet modest changes. And it depends a bit on which outcome and where, with rally effects predominantly focused in the US, like I said. And so what I think what we need at this point in this literature is really to push ourselves further to focus more on non-Islamist terrorism, as well as on non-Western countries. Because in the beginning, I was talking about these cognitive and affective processes, and these always take place within context and within a certain country with a certain history. But yet we don't know yet how these levels interact, how these emotions interact with societal forces. So I really think that's such an integrative approach where we focus on different levels of analysis and compare different countries or different settings can really bring us to a more nuanced and a more honest answer or accurate answer to the question, how is terrorism changing us? And so that's what the paper argues, says, and like I said, I also built a Shiny app to push the literature further where I ended in the paper. And so in the Shiny app, it's basically to explore more the heterogeneity because I compare so many attacks in so many countries that people might rightly wonder if I'm not comparing apples and oranges. So here you can tease out a little bit the apples from the oranges, because you can choose your country of study, your design, the type of terrorism, or the outcome category. And then first you get a list of the papers that have studied your subsample. So here, this starts you with your literature review, so you can start looking into these papers. But of course, it also gives you an indication of how many people have studied that specific question. So did you find a gap or not? And then based on your parameters, the app also gives you the overarching correlation coefficient. For instance, this one is the one for outgroup hostility. It's the same number as I showed in the table. And so from here, you can do future power analyses, or you can take it from there. And so if you have any idea to push the data further, I'm very happy to always collaborate, because after 5 years of research, I think the data can be used more. And other than that, I'm very much looking forward to other questions, suggestions, comments on the paper, the app, or anything else in between. So thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Amelie. Excellent presentation. Very nice, and I've had the pleasure to see this project develop over time. But it does always get me thinking again. So first, let me say, people in Amsterdam coordinate with Diamantis. If you want to say so, I have a question for Amelie. The people who are joining via Zoom, you can type your questions in the Q&A box and I will read them out loud. So while everybody is deliberating about their questions, I make use of my right to speak. And so this is something, Amelie, that I've been thinking about in recent period is what now does a correlation, a meta-analytic correlation of 0.14 mean? Because on the one hand, you could say, well, you know, you're kind of nice to the literature, right? To say, well, it's there, but it's there under the scope conditions and maybe should not over-exaggerate. But if we would try to substantiate what then would an average terrorist attack within the Western world do to average public opinion given this meta-analytic effect size? In other words, is this a substantively meaningful effect, or do we say, well, it's a effect that we can detect once we have enough observations, but honestly, terrorism does a lot of bad things to the world, but it might not shift public opinion all that much?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and one I have struggled with myself when I was writing the paper, and like, okay, how do I know, like, contextualize this effect, right? And I think there's a scientific and a very nuanced societal answer to that question. And scientifically, we see that, for instance, if you translate to the very well-known feelings thermometer, you would, like a terrorist attack would shift you from a 50, so a very neutral position towards Republicans or towards immigrants, to like 43 or 47, like 57. So it's a 7-point change. That's what it means if you want to compare to scales that we know. If it's then substantially like in society and for politics, I think it depends. Like, I think, for instance, what we see is very important when politicians capitalize on what they think is a substantive change, right? Often in the wake of an attack, politicians will say, like, public wants more military intervention or military spending or a Patriot Act, for instance. So once politicians capitalize on what they perceive as a change, it becomes important. Or secondly, we also see that quite a lot of attacks actually happen in the run-up to elections. And then even a few percentage changes in the public opinion might translate into a vote change, because hopefully a lot of people in your nation go voting, right? And then even a few percentages translate into a lot, like tens of thousands, maybe millions of people if we talk about the United States. So yes, I agree as a scientist that it's a very modest effect if we compare it to the literature. But then again, also if you compare it to other recent meta-analysis, it's not that small in a social scientist. I think of Pollock's meta-analysis on prejudice reduction. If you look at like decently powered studies and good studies, they are even weaker than what I found. So it's very comparable, I think, what we find as social scientists. And then it's our role as a social scientist to think, how does that translate into the world? And I think if politicians capitalize on it, if it's close to elections, also sometimes actually terrorist organizations capitalize on it. Like, there's beautiful studies on the narratives of extremists that say, like, look, you're not welcome in Western countries, so join ISIS, for instance. So also if they capitalize on it, it becomes a very important like interaction between the public, politicians, extremists, that is a word, examining more. And I think it's also our goal then as a researcher to really say, like, look, we found very modest changes, and to disseminate that more in the hope that politicians might listen sometimes and not capitalize on something that is not really there, right? Mm-hmm. So it really depends a bit on what politicians do with it, whether it's in the run-up to an election, how extremists do it, but it stays a small effect. There I fully agree with you.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So just a quick follow-up on that. But if you then look at, well, you've read all these studies, right? How mindful are we on average about talking about these effects? So in other words, are we careful enough in the literature on this topic, or I'm actually not part of that, but our social scientists, careful enough in sort of discussing the modest nature of that effect size, or do you also see indications that this is maybe with the urge to sell or to create a sense of urgency of importance of a project, that we are exaggerating the interpretation of the exercises?
Yeah, I think that's a really cool, interesting question, because of course we do have these like competing incentives to publish and to have a nice story, but then there's the data. And I think actually what I saw in the literature is that it evolved really over time. So in the beginning, and I think it's also a bit related to the open science movement, we were just not very aware of what an effect size meant and how big is it, and compared to other studies or compared to like real life behavior. So then, we saw a lot of narratives and very threatening narratives, like the democracy is at risk narrative. And then it changed it over time, I would say, and especially now in 2020, 21, 22, we saw a lot of very powerful like natural experiments that were high in internal and external validity. And we saw a shift in more nil results and a shift in the narrative. So I think it did change over time. People became more aware about the need to translate effect sizes to real world changes, and designs became better and effect sizes decreased, not always significantly. So I found the decrease only for rally effects, but I have to say some beautiful null results were just published after my data collection in 21 and 22. So that's a bit unfortunate. But I think, it has changed over time, and we are more cautious nowadays with quantifying and translating the effect to the real world.
Would actually be a cool follow-up study to do, to actually to do sort of maybe a random sample of your 1,000 studies and content code the narrative on the effect sizes, and that would be a fun thing to do. Hey, there's a question from Christian von Sikorski. Great paper, great talk, thanks. How does the point of data collection, often directly after attacks happen, potentially affect results?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I also coded it. So I coded whether indeed the outcome was measured directly after the attacks, or also, of course, within a cross-sectional study, whether they asked about terrorism threat or emotions and then the outcome at the same time. Or I coded how many days there were in between the attack or the experimental manipulation and the outcome measure. And we see that for outgroup hostility, indeed, it changes results. So the more time there is, like if there's a delay between the dependent and the independent variable, or independent and dependent variable, the effect size increases substantially. However, for the political conservatism and the outgroup, the rally effects, I did not find such a strong delay effect. But of course, a lot of studies don't have that delay. So that's also one of the results or one of the conclusions of the meta-analysis, that we need more studies with this delay so that we know that a bit, or preferably panel studies, because we have no idea whatsoever how durable these effects are. I do agree that I think it's often a spike right after the attacks, but we just don't have the data on it. And there's another narrative review by Paul Snyderman and colleagues that argues a little bit the same thing. Like it's probably a short spike, also politicians and narratives and rhetoric factors in, but we don't really know what the duration of this effect. So yeah, I agree that that's a crucial way forward as well. Apart from more non-Islamic and Western studies, it's also longer time gaps and panel studies that we need to answer this question.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is from Hulda Torisdottir. I hope I pronounced that right. But I think, Hulda, you will be coming to Amsterdam soon at our political psychology meeting with Janneke van der Toorn, which would be great. Thanks, very interesting and timely work. Did you consider looking at support for something like counterterrorism measures?
Yeah, so this is also one of the outcomes in the cluster of political conservatism. And there we do see stronger effects. So both for right-wing authoritarianism and more measures pinpointed at terrorist attacks or counterterrorism, we see stronger effects. And I think, of course, that's easily linked to the cognitions and emotions that often drive these results, because people want the threat to be solved, right? They don't want to be afraid, they're angry, so they want action. And we see that these measures that do give them action or do give them a resolution to the threat, they are influenced more strongly. But the substantive differences are not as strong as, for instance, the country differences for rally effects. Like there, the 9/11 effect, it explains so much variation in effect sizes. And here for the outcomes within the cluster of political conservatism, there is something, some more specific attacks or outcomes have stronger effect sizes, but it's a weaker in predictive predictability or predictive power.
Interesting. Diamantis, I'm gonna hand over the word to you for some moderation in Amsterdam. Yes. You might have a question yourself.
Thank you, Bert, and thank you, Amelie. Of course, I also have a question myself, but I'd like to first give the floor to people here in the room who have some questions. So please speak up and let us know.
Okay. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I probably a bit against Bert's conclusion. I find it fascinating that you find this. I mean, it's overall, it's the kind of the overall effect size, no, for this kind of diverse. It's not something that terrorist attacks have no direct effect on our daily lives for most of us, no. So that you still, it is like outsiders find this. I find it fascinating, and I will give that to my students next year for sure. I had a question. Or you mentioned that it's all context specific, no, and this of course makes sense. But I was interested if you also have something to look at more within population differences, no? That the effect might be, I know, stronger for some, depending on some characteristics of the people, like, I know, religiosity, age, partisanship, or sophistication, whatever you want to have. So that would be, I think, another value for research, no? That we might give up this idea that terrorist attack has this broad overall effect, but they might have quite targeted effect, which of course still then can have serious consequences for elections, of course. No, that if some voters are only affected, but these are the crucial ones to change election outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. And in the paper, I do look at that as well, especially more in the appendix, for two reasons. First, of course, with a meta-analysis, you never have the individual data. So I do know whether the sample was more male or was younger, or like average age of the sample. Sometimes like whether it was a minority or majority sample, left leaning or right leaning, but you never know the individual data. But then using this aggregate data, I actually found very, very little heterogeneity based on individual characteristics. So more female samples did not lead to stronger effect sizes. Also more right-leaning samples did not lead to substantive changes, which was something that I was very interested in, because like we often have this hypothesis that it's actually left-wing leaning people that will shift, because right-leaning people, they already support counterterrorism measures, or they already support far-right or more right-wing parties and politicians. But I didn't see that more left-wing samples resulted in different results. What I did find was for the outgroup hostility, there was an effect of having student populations. So that there was something there, but that was basically it to what sample composition concerned. So very little there to be found.
So I'd like to follow up actually on this question, if I'm allowed to take the floor. So many sociologists might actually often discuss terrorism from a constructivism perspective, saying that terrorism as a label is actually a social construction. And of course, we know that there is a vast majority of studies that have been conducted following the 9/11 terroristic attacks. So I've got a question about that. So to what extent and when is actually an event labeled as a terroristic event? And to what extent 9/11 was the sort of landmark in this line of research? But mainly, and to follow up on your question, my question has to do with whether the attack itself is conducted by a group of extremists or by an individual on its own, and whether this plays in the findings that you observe. In other words, do specific features of the terrorist attack itself actually predict variability in the effect sizes that you see?
Yeah, thanks for these two great questions, and I could not agree more on the first point. I think not only this study, but a lot of the studies that I have been doing points to the social constructivist narrative around terrorism. So I do think indeed 9/11 was a crucial point where narratives changed, policies changed, people's thought changed, and the Islamist jihadist terrorist became the terrorist. There was no other terrorist. And we see with cycles of violence that it often changes, like it's very constructed who the terrorist is at a certain moment in time. And I think that's one of the main conclusions as well of this thesis or of this paper and of my dissertation actually, that yes, it's very often a labeling effect. So what the enemy is in our head is citing a lot of what we see happening in politics, in our attitudes and all that. And I think it's very often you need the outgroup at a certain moment in time that is labeled a terrorist attack. So it's very important to see like who is the dominant party in a country. So who's the majority, who's in power, and then who's the outgroup. And these in-group, out-group dynamics very often determine who will be labeled a terrorist in politics and rhetoric, and then how the public will respond to them. And that's why I say, like, I do think that we're actually at a crucial point where extreme right terrorism might be labeled more and more as terrorist. And hence, if I would do this study in 10 years, it might be quite different, and we might see a new cycle of new studies. Because like the graph where I showed that extreme right terrorists are not in my data, I think it's not just because they're not there. I think they're there, but they were just not labeled as terrorism by scholars, by us. And I think that is changing as well, that this type of violence is not just seen as extremism anymore, but more and more labeled as terrorist as well. So I fully agree that there is a very big labeling effect going on here, both in what I found and how I study it, but then also how the people react to it. And like, I think it's Brian Phillips recently published an article on that, like which terrorist organizations are labeled terrorism. And it's a beautiful paper. I wish I have written myself, because it's basically the continuation of my dissertation. And yeah, it points to that labeling effect as well. Then the question about whether the effect was a group effect or a lone wolf, that's a very interesting one that I did not code. So I coded like how lethal the effect was it transnational or domestic? Again, found very little variation, but I did not code whether it was a lone wolf or a group attack. However, we do see that like these right-wing extremist attacks, they're often, especially in the heads of people, again, linked to people like Anders Breivik and lone wolves. Well, even though Islamist terrorist attacks sometimes are conducted by just one individual, they're seen as, see, it's again the jihadist group, right? So I think the two questions are actually a bit connected to each other, and that we do probably see that even though it's an individual Islamist attack, it's more seen as a bigger threat, like a bigger group threat to us than the individual attacks. And again, their research points that if you threaten people with vignettes, and one vignette is the individual and one is a group attack, that people do take that a little bit into account. So the effect sizes are stronger for the group manipulation. And I think, again, that has to do with threat perceptions, because the threat is seen bigger if it's perpetrated by a group. But I did not code it, so I don't have very systematic data on it, but I know there's one study, and I also know that people often think an individual Islamist attack is just conducted by the group as such, and will work labeling terrorism as such. So.
Thank you. I see that Bert is raising his hand.
Yeah, let's make it.
Perhaps we could follow up.
No, it's actually a question. Do you have a follow up on this, Diamant? Because there's also a question in the chat.
No, we also have like I think Christian and Mikey also have like a couple of questions.
Let's first do Tobias' question and then go back to Amsterdam to really make it fully hybrid. Tobias Rohrbach, who is partly affiliated with our lab, writes this. Thanks for the concise synthesis of a field. A more general question. Have you had any responses from the field to your analysis? People who disagree or disagree with. So any fan mail, Amelie, or any hate mail that you want to disclose here on camera?
Yeah, hi Tobias, nice to see you again, and I hope you're safe and sound back in Amsterdam or Switzerland. No, I don't have hate mail or fan mail yet, so I hope this will be coming. People have asked to present the paper, so I take that as a positive sign. But I think what is interesting to say that I think the field was so welcoming when I started this project. So I reached out to a lot of peers for extra data, things I could not calculate yet, and they were always very willing to provide their primary data or to like plug in the results that I needed in the Excel list that I made. Like I often said, like I just need a sample size, or just need this mean or this standard deviation. And there a lot of people replied to my emails. Sometimes I had to email 2 or 3 times, but I was generally very positively surprised with how helpful this field of study is, like how welcoming they were and willing to help, willing to just send me the whole data set. So that was really nice and very helpful. That's also why I have quite a lot of effect sizes and studies in the meta-analysis in the first place.
Christian von Sikorsky just declared that he has already sent you fan mail some time ago. So that has happened. And
sent me data if I remember things correctly, or extra information. So
excellent. Okay. And you've gotten some praise yesterday or this week on social media for sure. So okay. Let's go back to Amsterdam for questions from Mike.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Amelie. Really cool presentation and a cool project. Really nice to see it and to hear about it, and that you have an app. Really great. I was wondering whether you looked into the type of manipulation, because you said that maybe sometimes in a study people are asked like, how did you feel when it was 9/11, or they maybe just after a terrorist attack, or maybe if they, I'm not sure if there were texts about like describing a certain terrorist attack. I was wondering whether there's also a difference, because I can imagine also, especially with emotions, that if you're asked like, how do you feel about it, or maybe if a text describing a terrorist attack is talking about blaming someone, as Isabella also in our lab focuses on, that can also lead more to anger than actually to fear. So I was wondering whether you really looked at like the manipulation and how that affects the results.
Yeah, so with time, there's a lot to unravel in the meta-analysis, which sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. So one thing over time that we see is if you just look at attacks itself and like natural experiments pre and post attacks, we do see a decline over time. So it does seem that people start to be a bit more desensitized to terrorist attacks, or just that science got better. I think there's also a lot of open science reasons that might explain this attack, this decline. So time matters there a little bit. Again, not always very strong, but we see that later studies on later attacks have less effect sizes. Then another thing about time, what we discussed before, is indeed this delay, where again, sometimes we see a smaller effect size with studies that have a delay between the measurement of the independent variable, so the terrorism exposure, and the outcome variable. But an interesting question that you suggested a little bit, which I did not code, is how long there was between these studies that ask people to remember something and the attack. Because sometimes even nowadays people still ask where were you at 9/11 and how did you feel, even though it's such it's already 2 decades ago, right? And so I did not code whether that is an effect. I found that effect sizes are larger if they refer to 9/11, even though if they refer to 9/11 in 2015, they still have a larger effect. But I did not systematically code that time effect, which is an interesting one as well, I would say. No. I hope that answered your question a little bit.
And Christian also,
yeah,
Christian.
My question goes quite a bit in the same direction. You showed the graph with the studies and how the effect sizes diminish over time, and there are some interesting outliers with extremely large but also extremely large negative effects. What's going on there? Did you look into that? Well, is there any way? Do you have something in common, or?
That I don't know, but of course in the appendix I do some robustness checks with these outliers. So I delete those that have extremely large positive or negative effects, or have very wide variation, very underpowered, and that does not change the results substantively. So even kicking them out still shows the same results. However, I did not do that for a time trend. So I just know that on average, they don't change the 0.13 or the 0.09 results, but I haven't looked actually whether the decrease would stop being decreasing. If you I know there are some outliers probably in the very early years, so I might actually check whether they shifted a lot, but I don't think they would because the meta-analysis is very, very powered because there are a lot of individual participants within each study. So kicking out a few studies actually doesn't change that much. I noticed.
That's not what I would have thought anyway, because I mean it's just like 3-4. But I was just wondering if you looked at these studies, because I would be curious, why did they find such huge effect? Do you have any?
Because often these studies are relatively underpowered, and then we know that effect sizes just can bounce a bit everywhere. So I fear that's mainly the reason what's going on there. And every now and then there are a few studies that also have a very large effect size. And I think actually of one where the treatment is very close to the outcome measure. And so I wasn't wondering, like this was one of the difficult studies, whether or not to include it in the meta-analysis. It's the one, I think it's Noor Kitaili's work, where it's about blaming someone for terrorist attack and then outgroup attitudes. And of course, these things are already much closer to each other than just the attack as such. And so that's a bit, the perks and downsides of meta-analysis. It's sometimes very hard to say okay, this one is in or out. And that's, for instance, one of the larger effect sizes that is theoretically very explainable, but it's also quite hard.
There is an additional question on the Q&A, and I believe that Bert perhaps also would like to follow up.
Yeah. Okay. So Tobias Robrach again has a question. What is your view on meta-analysis as tool for guiding policy decisions, as is often the case in other disciplines like medicine?
Yeah, sometimes I wish I was a doctor to have more influence with my research. I think that's one of the main things I still want to improve in my research. I think it has so much to say to policymakers. It has something to say about what is happening in your public, for the good and the better. I think politicians can use it to not capitalize on it, to calm down people after an attack to not capitalize on it. But on the other hand, it also shows that some things will work, that for extreme right politicians, it does work to capitalize on it. So maybe I don't hope they don't read it. But yeah, there is a lot of policy implications here. But I don't think my HGPS piece will be read by a lot of politicians. I don't have that naive hope. But yeah, it just points to effects, and it's something I sometimes struggle with myself, because these things show that terrorism works in some ways, which of course, yeah, has important implications both for politicians and for the narratives of extremist ideologies. I still think it's important to research it, but it's indeed a question like, what now? Like, how do we translate this into advice? So yeah, it's not a very satisfying answer, I think, to your question, but yeah, I think politicians can use this to build narratives on for the better and the worse. But I'm not sure that they will do that, because I don't think they will follow someone in Norway.
Hey, Amelie, I want to ask you something about far right terrorism, because I had to smile a little bit when you said, like, hopefully in a couple of years that category will be higher. So yeah. Hopefully we shouldn't study this, but that's aside from that slip of the tongue, which was not my question. It's like, so I'm going to ask the question because I'm not to see if I understand the theory correct. Because what would far right terrorism, what would the theories predict when it comes to far right terrorism and its effects on ideology, on and on this rally effect? Because would that be the similar effect, or I don't see the conservative shift for the far right, because that would be moving in the direction of the terrorists. But I'm also not sure if I would expect a more liberal turn, maybe in New Zealand. But, or is this to do with what Ida and Lambert and others say? Well, it's in the end who's owning that issue, and is the response to far right terrorism, is that still open to be owned by politicians of different standing? So it's more a speculation question, and let's hope it's not necessary that this will be tested.
Yeah. Indeed, like, first a slip of the tongue. I really don't hope the category goes up, but from a scientific perspective, sometimes I get too enthusiastic about what I study. So my apologies for that. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what is key here is that with jihadist terrorism, this was or is an outgroup for almost everyone studied in the samples, right? No matter whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning, male, female, it is an outgroup. And I think that is shifting, making people shift across the ideological divide or across a lot of individual characteristics. With extreme right terrorism, it does not become an outgroup for everyone. And we know that it's not just a political identity. We know that in the United States, especially, political identity overlaps with racial identity, religious identity. It's a very strong cluster of identity markers. And I think then I do expect more polarization, actually, that left-wing leaning people might react more strongly on it than right-wing people, and hence we will just go more outside of each other. And we do find this interaction, which we don't find not now and then, like some studies do and some studies don't, after jihadist attacks. So there I do suspect a stronger interaction effect with people's own political ideology and the political ideology of the attackers.
Conditional
on your own, your race, or rather your own political ideology. So I think if you're right-wing leaning and there's a right-wing attack, you won't be as strongly opposed to it, because it's your own identity that's a little bit questions or doing something wrong. And we know from blame attribution theory that when it's your own in-group, you will find these external forces, like we had to because our nation was under threat, or like our way of living is under threat. So yeah, in this case, it was justified to use violence, right? So we see that with in-group violence, we will have these like external blame attributions, which is not the case with out-group violence. It's more easy to blame the out-group. Yes, it was the group as such that is responsible, and not some external factor. And then again, like also what you said, I think again, rhetorics are very important. So right-wing extremism in a right-wing climate will be discussed and talked about in such a different way than Islamist terrorism was talked about or is talked about nowadays. So again, there is this macro level constitution or contextual level factor that we need to take into account, like how do we talk about it? And we see that narratives are very different. Like my other research showed that we do talk differently about right-wing attacks, especially in the right-wing climate, which we saw after some attacks in the US in the former presidency.
It will be interesting of this sort of threat ownership theory, because while it's owned by the right,
yeah, exactly. And you do know that I have some work in a pipeline that has been there for a very long time, that we do make this argument, right? That right-wing politicians are linked to the ones that keeps us safe from terrorism, like the law and order issues.
Yeah.
And hence they have more this issue ownership, or more the ability to take away the threat more, because their claims will be more credible when they say like, we will intervene and we will take care of this. They use that narrative a lot with Islamic terrorism. So we will intervene in Iraq to crush ISIS. It would be very interesting to see what happens after the right-wing attack. We do see that then they say like, it's not such a big threat. We don't really need to change our weapon laws, for instance. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how their issue ownership also colors the narrative after right-wing attacks in the US or in Western countries in general.
Great. I'm already going to say thank you for this fascinating talk, and I'm going to hand over the floor for Diamantis for the formal thank you and some announcements.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Amelie, I'd also like to take the opportunity and thank you for this terrific presentation on terrorism. Of course, when the time is right and we meet you, hopefully in Paris or who knows when and where, this is our Hot Politics mug, and it's well deserved, and it belongs to you. So we'll keep it here safe until the time we see you. And for the rest, we have 2 minutes to 4 o'clock, according to my clock, which means it's time to say goodbye. But before we do that, let's announce some names for the coming 2-3 weeks. So next week, it's a Graduate Friday session in the Hot Politics Lab. So we have our Micah Holman actually, together with Chiara Vialli, who are presenting their work with the title on Consequences on Emotional Politicians, a Conjoint Experiment. And another title, Personality and Political Information Consumption, the Mediating Role of News, Use, Motives. And then on March 4th, we have Matthijs Rooddown, our Matthijs from the Hot Politics Lab, who will be giving a talk with the title Creating Empathy During a Theater Play, experimenting with 7,000 people. So we very much look forward to these interesting presentations, and more will follow. Until next week, thank you all for joining the Hot Politics Lab.
Thanks for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Amelie. It's great.
Hope to see all of you soon.